Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Akakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders, great millstone, for teachings of truth and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. And listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house in these times. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick on Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to go through this idea of gleaning. I wanted to go in through the custom of gleaning, one of the laws within our culture, and how it relates to actually caring for the poor, how a righteous society is really supposed to set up, how things were in the ancient times, how Esau basically is ultimately like a niggard. The scriptures say that, riches are not comely for a niggard, because he hoards all the resources for himself. And then ultimately, it causes the people to suffer. This is why the people are in a state of mourning. Understand? So when certain laws are not being implemented, you understand, and realize these are the people, and this is the wickedness that perpetuates upon the planet Earth, right? So this is to also understand our culture, understand how things were done in the ancient times, and basically how the mindset of us was really supposed to be able to care for the people who are ultimately less fortunate, you know, people who were orphans, people who were widows, people who had maybe lost their so-called dependency and needed something to eat, or maybe even Israelites that were sojourning in the land in the ancient times. How were things back then, right? So without rambling, I wanted to just hit a couple points on this, and I sincerely pray and hope, that this lesson would be edifying, right? Because, when you go into certain things, in which I will get later on, it helps to also understand ancient customs of how things were done, right? So, I guess I'll start off here and I'll get an example of it. So, let me get a little bit of, I want to reference this book here. This is called Manners and Customs of the Bible, right? It's by J.M. Freeman. So, I'm going to read number 239 of how things were done in the ancient times, right? So here it says gleaning. Let me get the etymology first, and it says to gather by acquisition, scrape together, especially grains left in a field after harvesting. But the earliest use in the English is figurative, right? It says here to glean, to make a collection. He collects or gathers. Basically, literally, it translates to the gather grain left by the reapers, right? So after, like say for example, in the ancient times, you had a harvest, or you had a plot of land. You probably were growing pomegranates, maybe you were growing dates, maybe you were growing figs, or grapes or something like that. After you or corn, wheat, whatever it was, right? Because this is how we used to live in the ancient times, right? After that was done, there would be some that was left over. So not everything basically was, picked up during that harvest, right, so to speak, right? So this is how we lived in the ancient times. So when we went into the land of, Canaan, and the tribes received their different portions, of the land, this is how we lived. We lived off of the land. It wasn't like there were no supermarkets back then. It wasn't no Walgreens or Metro or Longos or anything like that. When you think about, how we go to our enemies ultimately for the want of all things, we basically, that was real true riches and sovereignty, right? So let's get the custom here. And again, I pray and sincerely hope that this lesson really and truly is edifying, right? So here it says gleaning. This is page 344. It says the Israelites were commanded by their law to be merciful to the poor. It says the corners of the field were not to be reaped. If a sheaf should be accidentally left in the field, right? So maybe you had maybe a wheat farm a wheat farm, you know. If that bundle was left behind, then you would just leave it, right? So it says here, if a sheaf, I'm sorry, should be accidentally left in the field, it was allowed to remain there in the field. Their grain in the corners, these odd sheaves in the field were for the poor. It says the story of Ruth is a most beautiful illustration of this law, right? So I want to get an example of that, what she was doing, right? Just to get an understanding how things were done in the ancient times, how agriculture has dramatically changed, throughout, in our time, and how important it is for the heathens to actually be taught this, in the kingdom of heaven, right? Because this is the thing they're going to be on. They're going to know how to actually. They're going to have to implement these particular laws, right? That is the role of a priest. The priest is supposed to be able to teach, the heathens, because look at their ways. Their ways are not upright, right? So let me get an example of that here in the book of Ruth, right? So this is chapter 2 verse 1, and the point is in 3, right? So it says here, and Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Ahimelech, and his name was Boaz. So when you go into the story, Boaz basically was a descendant of the tribe of Judah, right? So he's also listed within Yahushai's genealogy in Matthew, the first chapter, showing you it was a bloodline that Yahushai actually came from, right? So Boaz just so happens to be of this particular bloodline here, right? I believe he's the great grandfather, if I'm not mistaken, right? You can get that within Matthew 1 as well as the end of the book of Ruth, right? So here it says, this is verse 2, and Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, so Naomi is basically, she's basically like a widow, right? And Ruth here is like one of her servants accompanying her, right? So let me turn this up. So this is verse 2, and it says, and Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, let me go now to the field and glean ears of corn after him whose sight in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, go, my daughter. Right, this is verse 3, and it says, and she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, right? So after the reapers came, like you might have had maybe like a giant, like some ancient farming tools that you would use, like a scythe or something like that, to be able to harvest your your produce, your crops, whatever you're growing, because these are principal things, of a man's life, right? These are things that you need to be able to sustain yourself as a man, and this is an element of sovereignty our people have strongly lost, right? Because of disobedience. Now the Lord put us in a situation in captivity where we have to go to our enemies for the want of all things, right? So as a matter of fact, since I mentioned that, this is a precept I normally reference. Just bear with me. Let me just get it. This is Ecclesiasticus chapter 39 verse 26, and it says here, and the principal things of the whole use of man's life are water, fire, iron, and salt, flour of wheat, honey, milk, and the blood of the grape, and oil, and clothing, All these things are of good to the godly, so to the sinners they are turned into evil, right? So these are things, you would use in the ancient times. Even like now, you still use a lot of these things. But all of these things that I just read here, they're all contaminated in some kind of way. You know, they're all, either it's been pasteurized, either it's been refined, um, either it's not being cultivated properly. You know what I'm saying? So all these things Esau has his hands on, him having the fatness of the earth, going back to Genesis. You know, all these things are good to the person that is godly, right? But to a sinner, all these things are actually now just turned into evil. Where you think they're supposed to be benefiting you, the absolute, in this condition, in this society, is the complete contrary, right? So continuing on in verse 3, Ruth chapter 2, it says, and Rahab was to light on the part of the field belonging to Boaz, and was of the kindred of Ahimelech, right? So Ahimelech basically was the husband of Naomi, and Boaz here was a kindred of Naomi, right? And basically, Ruth, she was basically what's the word I'm looking for? Gleaning, picking up whatever was left after the reapers had collected that bundle of that harvest, right? So this is how things were done in the ancient times, right? You know, these were particular things that practices of how we did things, right? Because we didn't actually have, like I said before, supermarkets and all these what we see today, because all these what convenience has done in this society has stripped away a lot of these different skills, right? So now let's get the law on this, right? And go from there. Just bear with me. So this is Leviticus chapter 19, verse 9. And it says, and when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. Thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of the vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord Yahweh, your power. So in these situations, when you had, a vineyard, you had trees that maybe have been very, very fruitful, that had meat, that had seeds or fruit or whatever, you wouldn't take all the resources from that particular vineyard or from that particular tree. You know, what you would do is you would make sure some was set aside for people who were less fortunate, like it mentions here, the poor and the stranger. And I believe that word stranger goes into gar, right? So let me just double check this just to make sure. Yes, so here it says gar, right? So you would have had Israelites that were not, they were Israelites by blood, but they were probably sojourning, in the land, right? Maybe they didn't have all the resources, so to speak, right? So, the point is, you left that there just to make sure, because what the law really teaches you to actually have a consideration for the Heavenly Father's ways, right? And actually looking out for your fellow kinsmen, right? That's an aspect of it when you think about it, because that's an aspect of love that we actually have lost as a people, because we ignored the ways of the Heavenly Father. It's supposed to actually, point towards that consideration for your fellow kin, right? And making sure that they had some substance to eat, by the more Jake, stayed in Babylon and got away from the Holy Land, the less of these this culture, this Israelite culture, they eventually began to slip away from them. It's very fragmented. I'm speaking for myself, being from the islands. It's very fragmented in the Caribbean, but it's also mixed in with all these different abominable ways of the heathen, as Jeremiah explained, because we're not supposed to learn the ways of the heathen, right? And then when you get to Babylon, it's like there's a complete, understanding of there's no is I should say there's a lack of understanding when it comes to the ancient way being under an oppressive people. So that Jake takes on the vibration of the heathens, right? The scriptures say that the righteous is more excellent than his neighbor, but the ways ultimately of the wicked seduce them, right? So they've been seduced into a way that is not profitable, for them, because we're really supposed to be actually upright as a people, right? So let me continue on here. Just bear with me. Where was I? Let's get another example. Let's get it in a another translation. This is Deuteronomy 24, verse 19 in the Amplified, and it says, "And when you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf of grain in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the stranger, the orphan, or the widow, so that the Lord Yahweh may bless you in all the work of your hands. And when you beat the olives off your olive tree," right? When you look in the land right now, that is a resource that the so-called Palestinians, continue to use, right? And it says here, "Do not search through the branches again. Whatever is left, it shall be for the stranger and the orphan and for the widow," right? So this is really your original welfare system. This is your the way how the Lord actually intended us to actually maintain the earth, because we're really not supposed to be niggards. Yes, that's when Jake is known. Like, if you type those words in on Google, you might most likely you're gonna see a face of Israelites, but Esau is really the actual original niggard, right? And the reason I'm saying this is because of this. When you go to Jeremiah, this is part of the language that is mentioned in the book of Jeremiah, the 49th chapter. Let me get it here. This is Jeremiah 49, verse 9. And it says here, "If grape gatherers come to thee, will they not leave some grapes? If thieves by night, will they not steal till they have enough?" Right? So if a thief broke into your house, they're not gonna steal what they want and then they're gonna make off and go their merry way. But Esau is the type of person, that he will take everything for himself and leave the people with nothing. This is why a lot of the people, our people, even the heathens that are, within Babylon as well, they're very disgruntled. They have a very distaste towards their leaders. And ultimately, yes, that fuels certain prophecies such as sedition among men, and they shall not regard their kings or their princes, because Esau is ultimately a niggard. If you took care of your citizens properly, you wouldn't have these problems in the first place. You wouldn't have the poor, strung out on the side of the road, and then just basically left to the elements. The Lord's ways are ultimately higher. When we look at the way Babylon runs, we learn that why the Lord's ways are strongly needed upon the planet Earth, right? Because it shows that there's a disorder in this system, right? And it's strict, and it starts with the rulership. As is the king, so are the people. The people take on this vibration as well, because Esau is really the original niggard. Where you tribes are situated today, a lot of you tribes don't actually are not able to use and utilize the resources that you have because you don't own it, right? So this is verse 10 here, Jeremiah 49. But I've made Esau bare, and I've uncovered his secret places, and he is not able to hide himself, and his seed is spoiled, and his brethren and his neighbors, and he is not. So a good example of that, when you go into Nigeria, for example, Nigeria, the has massive reserves of oil, right? And then you had that company, the gas company Shell, that's been basically just been sucking that country dry of its natural resources, because he's, as it says in Habakkuk, he's as death and cannot be satisfied. And when you look at the state of that, of not just the actual environment as a whole, but the state of the people, there's more corruption. Like, this is what happens when he comes into your country. You know what I'm saying? So not only is he affecting the environment, his ways are ultimately affecting the people as well, right? So this is why righteous rulership is strongly needed, right? But I kind of wanted to start off showing and explaining the ways of the ancient customs of how things are really and truly is supposed to be, right? Because what we're living is not this is a giant simulation. This is not real. This is not how our people are really supposed to live. You know what I'm saying? So let me get here. As a matter of fact, let me go to Isaiah. Hold on. Isaiah 24 verse 5, and it says, the earth is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, and broken the everlasting covenant, right? So this is the what's going on the earth. The earth is mourning, and it's weaker, through age, and the way that they treat the land ultimately affects us, as a people. So, right, this is why Yahushua has to come and reestablish and put things, I don't want to say upside down, but basically right side up, because this is a complete mess of a society. The scriptures say, woe unto the land when a king is a child. When you think about a child needs to be, looked after. They constantly have to be mined. They constantly have to be, reminded. They have to be on complete supervision. This is not a society where you're being governed by nobles to make sure the responsibilities are actually taken care of and your subjects are being well looked after. When you go into the certain kings within our history, there was a king specifically, Jehoshaphat. He made sure that the priests were able to teach our people the importance of basically knowing the law, and that's very, very important. You don't have that in this society, right? So I guess I'll end off here. It's Isaiah 2 and 3, and it says, and many people shall go and say, come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the power of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, right? Showing you the laws are going to be taught in the kingdom, but they're going to be taught to the other nations, and the Israelites are going to be as priests, unto these other nations. Right, because when you look at their ways, their filthy, abominable practices, it's not actually bringing forth life. These other nations are supposed to look at your Israelites as understanding, as basically, you're the steward, you're the guy that knows how to run things. You're the guy in charge, right? So it says here, for out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks, and their nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither should they learn war anymore, right? So you're going to see it's basically going to be peace on earth, but the nations are going to be in slavery. They're going to be in subjection. They're going to be taught, because they need to be taught. They need to be recompensed. They need to be, properly instructed. You understand? So, that's pretty much the point, I kind of wanted to, go through, that, in regards to ancient customs, why Esau is a terrible, terrible ruler, right? And why righteous rulership really strongly is needed, right? So, Lord's will, this lesson was edifying. I just want to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.